Hello, everyone. Professor Krizlik here. So, I wanted to make the next video in our Introduction to International Relations course, this time focusing on realism, just the introduction to realism, and then there will be a series of videos that I make that look at different aspects and parts of realism. Same way, same thing we did with liberalism, whereas liberalism we first looked at it at the 30,000 foot level and then dug deeper into different aspects of liberalism. There's videos on when it has failed, when it has succeeded, some examples of liberal internationalism. So, kind of just continuing with that trend, today we're going to look at realism. I am trying something different this time. I am trying to utilize some PowerPoints as well. Oftentimes, for my 100 and 200 level, so lower division courses at university, I utilize PowerPoints. And then at the 3 and 400 levels, I prefer more of a discussion-based class. So I don't use PowerPoints in upper division courses, but I figured for an introduction to international relations, I'd at least make a couple videos with PowerPoints. So if you're a freshman or you're a sophomore and you're taking an IR course, hopefully the PowerPoints make it a little easier for you to follow along. And if it turns out that it's not popular, then I'll probably move away. Okay. So today we are going to introduce one of the most important theoretical traditions in international relations, and that is of realism. So we've talked about liberal internationalism, and that's one of the main schools of thought for international relations, and the other is realism. So the goal is not to decide whether realism is right or wrong, just like we didn't try to figure out, well, is liberal internationalism right or wrong? That's for you to decide. That's for you to think about and see what helps you understand the world. Instead, the goal is really to just understand what realism is, what assumptions it makes about international politics, and why it has been so influential in the study of war, in the study of peace, in national security, and in foreign policy. For instance, the National Security Senior Seminar that I'm teaching in the fall is really built on a lot of realist scholars' work. It is such a major school of thought within international relations. If you've been following the Iran-US conflict, you may have seen like John Mearsheimer on TV or Stephen Walt. Like these realist scholars are giants in the field, and they get a lot of television attention, a lot of media attention. Okay. So hopefully the slideshow works. I actually had to, this is the second time I'm recording this lecture because the first time when it recorded, no audio recorded. So hopefully it works better today. Hopefully the PowerPoint is showing and sound is showing. Okay. So one useful way to begin our lecture is to think about what realism what realism is. And through that we can think of a pretty basic question. Why is international politics so often marked by countries fearing each other, by competition between countries, and why is there so much conflict? Even when states claim that they want peace. Most governments say they want stability. Most leaders talk about that they want security. And most countries claim that their military policies are defensive. And yet, the international system is filled with military alliances. We know there's arms buildups. We know there's increases in defense budgets. We know intelligence operations occur around the world. And we know that there's security competition. And sadly, we know that there are occasional wars. So realism tries to explain these patterns and these phenomenon. So the textbook, the same textbook that we've been using, presents realism as one of the dominant traditions in international relations. It notes that realism has historically been a central point of reference for the discipline, even for theories that criticize it. So realism focuses especially, like we said at the outset, on conflict, on war, on power politics, the state itself, and of course, this idea and this term that we've heard over and over now of anarchy. It also claims a long intellectual tradition, often associated with thinkers such as Thucydides, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Morgenthau, and Waltz. So next slide. So at its simplest form, realism is a theory of international relations that argues that states operate in a world without a central authority, where survival and security are never guaranteed. Because no world government exists to reliably protect states. Each state must ultimately look after itself. This is what realists mean by the self-help system. And when realists talk about, they're skeptical about international organizations. So what does realism not mean? This does not mean that international politics is constant chaos. Remember, we learned about anarchy in IR context doesn't mean constant chaos. It does not mean that states never cooperate. It does not mean international law, diplomacy, or institutions are meaningless. But realism argues that these things operate within a deeper condition of insecurity. States may cooperate, but they cooperate cautiously. They may sign agreements, but they worry about whether other states will comply. They may participate in international organizations, but they do not usually surrender their core security interests to those organizations. So, as we have seen throughout our lectures thus far, the central concept to realism is this idea of anarchy. When we talked about liberal internationalism, we talked about how liberals try to handle a world of anarchy, and that idea is really rooted and built into realism. So, in ordinary language, maybe you hear it with your friends on university, anarchy often means disorder or chaos. In international relations, however, anarchy has a much more specific meaning. It simply means the absence of a higher authority above states. Within a country, there is usually a government that makes laws, enforces rules, um, polices violence, and claims the legitimate authority. In the international system, there is no equivalent world state. There are institutions like the United Nations, international courts, treaties, and diplomatic norms, but there is no single global government that can reliably enforce rules against all states at all times. So this is This is why realism begins with a sharp distinction um, um, between domestic politics and international politics. In domestic politics, authority is usually hierarchical. In international politics, authority is decentralized. No state No state is formally above another. States are indeed sovereign. This means that each state must think seriously about its own security because there is no security guaranteed protector above it. So, for students to think about, this is one of the most important points. Realists do not necessarily believe that states are always aggressive, not simply because leaders are evil. Rather, realists argue that even cautious or defensive states can become trapped in competition because they believe they cannot be certain about the intentions of other states. And so this leads to something that I'm going to make a separate video on because it's such an important piece of international security and realist foreign policy thinking. And that is this idea of the security dilemma. So let's think through the security dilemma. Imagine state A builds up its military because it feels vulnerable. Maybe it feels it's in a world, it's a scary world. From states A's perspective, this may be purely defensive. It wants to protect its borders, deter attacks, and reassure its citizens that they are safe. But state B may look at the same military buildup and see a potential threat. State B cannot know for certain whether State A's intentions will remain defensive in the future. So State B responds by building up its own military. State A then sees State B's response as threatening, which confirms its original insecurity. The result is the spiral. Each state may be trying to become safer, but the interaction makes both feel less secure. This is one of realism's most important and useful insights. Conflict can emerge not only from aggression, but also from fear, uncertainty, and mistrust. So from here, realism places heavy emphasis on power. Power can mean military capabilities, economic resources, geography, population, technology, alliances, and political will. Realists do not all define power in exactly the same way, but they generally agree that power matters because it shapes what states can do and what they can prevent others from being able to do. This is where the concept of balance of power becomes important. Realists argue that states often try to prevent any one state from becoming overwhelmingly dominant in the international system. They may do this by building up their own capabilities, which is called internal balancing, or by forming alliances with other states, which is called external balancing. In realist terms, alliances are not simply friendships. They are instruments of security. States align with others when they face common threats or when doing so helps preserve their position in the international system. So the textbook's discussion of neorealism emphasizes this structural logic. In Waltz's version, states are shaped by the structure of the international system. The key features are the organizing principles of the system, which again is anarchy. The fact that states perform similar basic security functions and the distribution of capabilities across states. Because no one else can fully be counted upon to provide security, states must provide for their own security. So, this brings us to an important distinction that our textbook lays out. Classical realism versus neorealism, sometimes called structural realism. So classical realism focuses more on human nature, political ambition, fear, prudence, and the hard choices leaders face. Classical realists are often interested in history, statesmanship, and political judgment. They ask how leaders should act in a dangerous world where moral intentions do not always produce moral outcomes. Neorealism, especially associated with Kenneth Waltz, shifts attention away from human nature and towards the structure of the international system. Neorealists argue that the basic problem is not simply that some leaders are ambitious or that some states are aggressive. The deeper problem is that states exist under anarchy. Even if states have different domestic systems, democracies, or authoritarian, they all face the same basic requirement. They must survive in a system where no higher authority can guarantee their security. So classical realism might say politics is shaped by ambition, fear, power, and the limits of moral idealism. Neorealism may say international outcomes are shaped by the anarchic structure of the system and the distribution of power among states. But both are realists, but they emphasize different causes. So another major realist claim concerns cooperation. Remember, with liberal internationalism, liberalism, we talked a lot about cooperation. Realists do not deny that cooperation happens. States trade, negotiate, sign treaties, join institutions, and work together on common problems. But realists argue that cooperation is difficult because states worry about dependency, they worry that the other side is cheating, and they worry about unequal benefits. This is where the distinction between absolute gains and relative gains matters. A liberal may say, if both states benefit from cooperation, then cooperation makes sense. A realist might ask a different question. Who benefits more? If one state gains more than another, that advantage could later be converted into military, economic, or diplomatic power. So, even mutually beneficial cooperation can create anxiety. So the textbook makes this point in its discussion of neorealism. Under anarchy, states worry not only about whether they gain, but about the asymmetric distribution of gains. Interdependence can create cooperation, but it can also create vulnerabilities. So this helps explain why realism is often cautious about arguments that trade, globalization, or institutions automatically produce peace. Realists may accept that these things do matter, but they insist that security competition does not disappear simply because states trade with trade with each other or belong to the same international organization. So, something else our textbook brings up that we should touch on is that realism is often accused of being cynical or immoral. Students may hear or in their textbooks may read about how realism and think it means might makes right or power is all that matters. Um, our textbook, and your textbook probably too, argues that this is too simple. Realists are indeed skeptical of moral crusades in foreign policy, but many realists are not rejecting morality altogether. Instead, they emphasize prudence and responsibility. A leader cannot only ask, are my intentions good? A leader must also ask, what are the most likely consequences of my actions? In this sense, realism often distinguishes between an ethic of conviction and an ethic of responsibility. An ethic of conviction focuses on acting according to moral principle. An ethic of responsibility focuses on consequences, trade-offs, and the burdens of political leadership. The textbook's discussion of realism's political morality emphasizes this point. It notes that realists tend to treat prudence, the careful judgment of consequences, as central political virtue. This is why realism does not automatically mean support for war. In fact, many realists have opposed wars they considered unnecessary, ideological, or strategically reckless. The textbook's case study on realism in the Iraq War highlights this point. Some prominent realists criticized the 2003 Iraq War because they believed Saddam Hussein could be contained and deterred, and because they thought the war underestimated nationalism, balancing behavior, and the difficulty of making another state by force. So this is an important teaching point that we should think about. Realism is not the same thing as militarism. Realists care about military power, but they are often skeptical of using force for expansive ideological projects. They tend to ask, what is the national interest? What is the balance of power? What are the risks? What are the costs? And what happens the day after military activity? So, when we think about realism, we should think of it as a way of seeing international politics, just like we did with liberal internationalism. Realism directs our attention to certain things: power, security, military capabilities, fear, uncertainty, alliances, state survival, and the limits of international cooperation. It is especially useful when we're studying war, deterrence, arms races, great power rivalry, and alliance politics. But realism has limits, which we can discuss later when we compare liberalism and realism. For now, we just need to think. We don't even have to decide whether realism is the best theory. We don't even have to try to come to that conclusion. But we need to understand what kinds of questions realism asks. A realist looks at international politics and asks, why do states fear one another? How does the absence of world government shape political behavior, state behavior, excuse me? How do power and military capability affect political outcomes? Why do alliances form? Why is cooperation difficult, even when states share interests? Why do wars reoccur over time? And why do leaders sometimes prioritize national interest over universal moral claims? So to conclude, realism is one of the foundational theories of international relations because it provides a clear and enduring explanation of why international politics is often competitive and dangerous. It begins from the assumption that states live in this anarchic world where survival cannot be taken for granted. Because of that, states must pay attention to power, security, and their relative position in the global community. Cooperation is possible, but it is fragile. Morality does matter, but it is constrained by danger, uncertainty, and responsibility. So, okay, thank you for our listening to our introduction into realism in our international relations course. So, I'm going to do the next video will be about the comparison between realism and liberalism. Then I have one lined up for the security dilemma. So keep watching for a deeper understanding about realism. We started at the 30,000 foot level, and now we will dig deeper into realism itself. Thank you.